healthy home. As she got older, she carried her unhealthiness into her work life and quickly realized that something very important was missing. She let her coworkers use her. She tried to please her superiors. She overworked herself, never stuck up for herself. She tied her worth to her work. All this left her unbalanced and unhappy. One day, she was whining about it to a friend, and they told her something she'll never forget. Girl, you need some boundaries. Boundaries? What are those? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to help you discover through this course. Okay, confession time. That girl was me. My name is Hannah Wachter, and I'm a self-worth coach. After growing up in an abusive home where there were no boundaries, I had to learn how to implement them in order to show up as my best self. Now, I'm extremely passionate about helping others discover their boundaries and establish them from a place of kindness, confidence, and self-respect. In this course, you'll learn what boundaries are, how they relate to your values, and how that aligns with your workplace. I'll also share practical communication do's and don'ts around boundary setting, including how to say no. And finally, we'll discuss how to live your boundaries in order to perform your best and feel more balanced. Ready to set some boundaries? I'm eager to give you the lowdown. Let's go. Hi, my name is Hannah, and I'm a hugger. My friend's father calls me Hannah the Hugger. I love hugging. I tell people it's my superpower. I really pride myself on giving people meaningful, deep hugs. It brings me a lot of joy. In my 20s, I believed everyone I met wanted a hug from me, whether they knew it or not. If you were in my path, watch out, because I was throwing my arms around you. Until one day, I met someone new. As I reached out to hug her, she recoiled, saying, "Please don't touch me. I didn't give you permission." I was so embarrassed and kind of humiliated. I wasn't trying to offend her. I just wanted to share my superpower with her, but she didn't want my hug. She must have noticed the shock on my face because she quickly said, "It's nothing personal. It's just a boundary I have." Well, that confused me even more. A boundary? What's that? Maybe you have the same question. After watching this lesson, you'll be able to describe what a boundary is and consider whether or not they're present in your life. So first, let's define what a boundary is. Boundaries are the lines you draw in relation to anyone or anything outside of yourself. You often hear parents say to young children, "You've crossed the line." What they mean is that the child has overstepped their limits. Boundaries then are also limits and rules that help you navigate your relationships. And you have all sorts of relationships, right? With food, friends, family, time, work, rest, the list goes on. Therefore, your boundaries, the lines you draw, appear in a wide variety of categories such as physical, verbal, emotional, just to name a few. Next, how you operate relative to those categories reveals whether or not you have boundaries. I mistakenly assumed that everyone enjoyed being hugged, but I was wrong. I didn't have physical boundaries, and I wasn't mindful that others would. To function at your very best as a human being or a stellar employee, you need to have boundaries in place and be aware that others do too. Despite what you think, you can't eat all the cookies in the cookie jar. You have to draw the line somewhere or else there'll be consequences. Finally, boundaries aren't a value judgment. They're merely distinguishing markers. When I went to hug that girl I didn't know well and she stopped me, she wasn't rejecting me and telling me I was a bad person. She was merely stating her needs and preferences, which were different from mine. Making others feel comfortable is an admirable quality. But when you do so at the expense of your own comfort, you hurt yourself in the process. The goal with boundaries is to value the other person and yourself equally through effective communication. Boundaries are healthy lines or limits you set so you can operate at your very best. Now that you recognize this, take time to consider what categories of your life need boundaries. I'll tell you a secret. In the end, I'm really glad that girl told me I couldn't hug her. Ever since then, before I hug someone, I ask first, and I can tell you it makes both of us feel really good. When I was in grad school, I had a friend that I was incredibly close to. We did everything together. It was wonderful. Then graduation day came, and though school was ending, we lived near one another and committed to staying in touch. That commitment was sustainable for a while until my friend moved across the country and I entered into another graduate program. Our lives became miles apart, mentally and physically. I tried to retain the same level of relationship we'd always had, but it just didn't work. Eventually, my friend got really upset with me. She wanted things to be how they were before, but they couldn't be. I knew I had to draw a boundary with her, and I felt guilty for doing so. I believed it was wrong. Little did I know how good setting a new tone in our relationship would actually be. And the same is true for you. Boundaries are good, essential pieces of your health, both personally and professionally. And after you watch this video, you'll be able to understand why setting boundaries is a healthy condition of your workplace. First, boundaries are deeply personal, which is good. How you perform professionally reflects who you are personally. We don't all have the same personalities or experiences, so we don't all have the same boundaries. Therefore, it's important to remember that your colleagues, your boss, even your partner can't read your mind, especially when they come from a different perspective. You might have a boundary that they don't have, so it won't occur to them when they've crossed it. That's where communication comes in, allowing you to express your personal boundaries. And if you never state what's personally important to you, then it will never be known and followed. Next, boundaries are good because they're empowering. They bring peace of mind. Sharing your boundary with someone takes courage. Why? Because you don't know how that person will respond. But that shouldn't stop you. Share anyway. Once you've overcome your fear and stated what you need, you'll feel relief knowing you said your piece and have been true to yourself. It's scary to draw a line. Boundary setting isn't necessarily easy, but easy and good aren't always the same thing. It might not always be easy, but you'll be stronger as a person for creating a healthier work environment by sharing what you need. Also, boundaries are a good gauge for what to do next. If someone crosses your boundary after you've told them about it, you need to either have a conversation with them or put some space between you and that individual. No one has permission to violate your boundaries, but remember, you don't have permission to violate their boundaries either. Finally, boundaries can help you avoid burnout. When you set boundaries, limits on your time or workload, you're also setting realistic expectations for yourself. Boundaries come from an awareness of what you can and can't do. They allow you to set a reasonable pace for yourself. When thinking of taking on a project, pause and remember your boundaries. Does it conflict with the limits you've set for yourself? Depending on your answer, you'll know what to do next. Now that you can define why and how boundaries are healthy and good for you, consider ways you can incorporate boundaries into your life, especially your professional sphere. I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but historically, I've been kind of a difficult roommate. I mean, I'd wash my dishes and clean up after myself, but looking back, I was kind of rude, especially when I'd come home from work. I've normally worked jobs that require me to talk a lot and put on my best self all day long. By the time I'd get home, I'd be exhausted, done with talking to people. Unfortunately, that meant I would ignore my roommates and glare at them if they even tried to breathe near me. Several hard conversations and living situations later, I finally understood that I valued my alone time. Being able to unwind was crucial for me. So when I got married and took on my 4 stepkids, I was able to come home, show love, and still get what I needed without being rude. I finally knew myself. In this lesson, you're going to gain insights on what you value and how that can support you in setting boundaries that allow you to be your best self in life and work. First, identify your values. Sounds simple enough, but it's not as easy as it seems. Sometimes you don't know what matters to you until you run into a situation that threatens it. My roommate situation is the perfect example. When I felt my alone time being jeopardized, I realized that it was vital to me. But I learned that the hard way. You don't have to. Take the time to ask yourself when you were the most happy or proud, satisfied and fulfilled. What were you doing? Who were you with? What about those experiences changed you for the better? How did it give your life meaning? By asking a few key questions like this, you can figure out what you deeply value without the difficult situation. From these values will come logical boundaries you can draw for yourself and others, allowing you to interact from an authentic place. Next, know that your values matter. You're allowed to think the way that you do, and you're allowed to draw boundaries from your core beliefs and needs. Having healthy boundaries is actually a sign of healthy self-esteem. It communicates to others that you value yourself, and people will notice that attitude and want to value you too by respecting your boundaries. This sets you up to confidently explore your potential and have higher quality relationships in your personal and professional life. People don't have to like or understand your boundaries to respect them. Your values and needs matter regardless. Finally, live your values and boundaries consistently. Despite what many people think, boundaries are a loving, kind thing to set into play. They help you interact with others authentically, and they help others see you as a whole person. With your boundaries known, everyone knows where they stand in relation to you, and that is actually a kind thing. They don't have to second guess themselves. They can show up confidently with you too. So live your values and your boundaries proud out loud and be consistent in their application. Don't shrink back. Consistency is key. This will bring a lot of relief to you and those in your work and home life. Take time this week to figure out your core values and how you can draw boundaries out of those values with kindness and flexibility. You can show up authentically as your best self. I believe in you. After graduate school, I wanted a simple job. I took on a receptionist position at a corporate company, and for 2 years, that experience was everything I wanted. But eventually, I was ready for more. Since I love to write, I applied for a role in the company's communications department. I got the job and moved desks. And that was wonderful too. My nerdy writing self was deeply satisfied. Until one day, I was asked to write for a satellite company related to my organization. When they told me the subject of the project I was to write on, my eyes went wide. I fundamentally disagreed with the argument they wanted me to make. How could I write a promotional piece for something I clashed with? It felt like using my superpowers for evil. I hoped that this was a one-time request, so I took on the project. But eventually, writing pieces I disagreed with became my norm. And in the end, because I knew I didn't align with my organization's mission and values, I left. After this lesson, you'll also be able to discern whether or not your values align with your role and organization. This process begins by asking 3 key questions. The first question you need to ask yourself is, what do I value? Most people run into a boundary issue with their organization, a situation where they feel their personal lines have been crossed because they haven't taken the time to get clear on what their values and boundaries are in the first place. And that's very normal. Sometimes you don't know what feels wrong until you experience it. But knowing who you are and what you hold sacred will help you greatly when you approach your work environment. In my case, I had to remind myself that when I felt uncomfortable writing on topics I disagreed with, that was because it crossed a personal value I had. Being clear on your principles makes it easier to recognize if they fit well together with your organizations. Next, ask yourself, what are the non-negotiable behaviors or values that, when present, directly conflict with what you believe? For example, if you value integrity, but notice leaders in your organization are consistently dishonest or bending the truth to guarantee certain outcomes, that's a red flag. That signals the type of environment you are in. And if that environment goes against what you naturally believe, there's going to be a conflict. And conflict usually leads to boundaries being crossed. Determining the values that are a barrier to your success will also tell you if you align with your role and organization. Finally, ask yourself, what does my organization value? This one seems like a given, but when's the last time you read your company's mission, vision, and/or value statements? It's easy to assume what your smaller team culture is like, but what about your organization as a whole? Get a clear picture of what your organization stands for, and then hold that up to what you stand for. Looking at the two things side by side will help you see clearly whether your work's proclaimed principles line up with what you are about as a person. When your values align well with those of your company and individual role, that's amazing and it allows you to be productive. Spend some time this week making a list of what you value and then go find your company's value statements. You're going to gain so much clarity knowing whether or not they align. I hate math, and math kind of hates me. I always got good grades in school unless it was math. I got the basics, but beyond that, it just didn't make sense. My math teachers always looked at me like I was crazy. They got frustrated with me, and I got annoyed with them. Why didn't I get it? Well, it didn't come naturally to me. So I just put my head down and tried to survive. Now, when it came to reading and writing in school, I'd light up. I loved the written word, and I felt like I was in my element. I aced every test and essay. It was like I had found my sweet spot. It was how my brain worked. I realize now that math isn't my strength. I don't see the world through numbers. I see it through words. When it came to math class, I had to survive. But when it came to literature, I thrived. In this lesson, we're going to discuss what comes naturally to you and how that helps you thrive in the workplace versus survive, merely exist at work. After this lesson, you'll understand how that relates to your boundaries, setting you up for success. First, it's important to understand that work, the effort you exert to accomplish a purpose or result, comes out of your core identity. Your work efforts are not meant to be the sum total of who you are, but they are extensions of who you are. Work should be your best talents and skill sets on display. So when you look at your life and where your work fits in, ask yourself, does this job reflect my strengths? If it doesn't, you'll continually come up against issues that feel like boundaries, lines that are being crossed, but are really indicators that you're working against what comes naturally to you and brings you energy. Next, work becomes labor, something that's hard and takes a physical toll on you when you are there for survival purposes only. We all have to make an income to live, but your job should not be solely about the paycheck. When possible, your job should excite you enough that you would pay your employer to do it. Loving your work means that you're going to do what it takes to keep things running smoothly. And one way you can do that is by having boundaries. Things like clear communication, keeping work to the appropriate hours, being realistic with yourself about what you take on. These basic healthy boundaries are your building blocks that give you a solid foundation and set you up to thrive at work. Lastly, don't force it. You gotta do what you gotta do to meet certain needs, but when you force yourself through a work scenario that you can't stand, you help no one. You won't produce quality work because you resent being there in the first place. This attitude will lead you to overstep your coworkers' boundaries, and you do not want to be that person. Not only that, you disrespect yourself. Boundaries are a measure of self-esteem. You put yourself down by staying in a situation that you don't enjoy and doesn't allow you to be your best. Some of your coworkers may notice your lack of self-respect, take advantage of it, and cross your boundaries. Don't work against yourself. Work with yourself. Now that you understand how boundaries relate to you being able to grow at work, commit to ways of implementing them. You're incredibly talented and deserve to thrive in your workplace. Four years ago, I took on a new entrepreneurial endeavor that I was ecstatic about. It would require a lot of hard work, focus, and dedication, but I didn't mind. I believed I had finally found the business I'd always been dreaming of owning. Until one day, I was sitting in an elite training meeting that I'd been hand-selected for. I'd grown my business so quickly that I was one of the top producers in my organization. I should have been overjoyed to be recognized in this way, but all I felt was bitterness. I couldn't care less what we were discussing. Afterwards, I realized I had poured so much of myself into my business that my life was way out of balance. I felt lost and I had no joy. It was the wake-up call I needed to make some important changes. In this lesson, I'll share 3 ideas that'll help you get real with yourself about your work and life habits, allowing you to have more balance in both areas. First, be kind to yourself. You don't have to have it all together all the time. In fact, no one does, not even your boss. And the sooner you embrace that, the more balanced you'll feel. It's easy to place pressures on yourself that don't truly exist, to hold yourself to an imaginary standard. This made-up pressure takes a mental and emotional toll on you that isn't sustainable long-term. Quite simply, you're too hard on yourself too often. So when something difficult is happening in your personal life that makes it harder to focus at work, or when an opportunity to enjoy life comes up that might take you away from your work, don't beat yourself up. Give yourself permission to be human. You don't have to perform perfectly at work every day. Next, have a strong self-care system. This might have been my greatest mistake with the business I built. I never turned off. I didn't allow myself to fully rest, and that burned me out. Rest is an essential part of a job well done. In fact, consider it mandatory for optimal performance. Make sure that you have a solid self-care routine and don't sacrifice it when other life or work demands call. If you have to adapt, remember, you can be flexible with the timing of your self-care, but not optional. Your self-care is non-negotiable. If it's not part of your weekly rhythm, you can say goodbye to having a healthy, balanced life. Finally, make sure you're filling your cup outside of work. This is a step beyond self-care. Once you're well rested, make a list of hobbies, activities, or service opportunities you can participate in. Work should not be your primary source of joy in life. It's wonderful to get satisfaction from a job well done, but that shouldn't be the only place you find a sense of fulfillment. When you're creating or contributing to society, your well-being and mental health improves drastically. And this energy will carry you through those hard moments at work that inevitably come. With these 3 tips in your back pocket, find situations this week where you can show yourself more kindness, more care, or greater fulfillment in a non-work arena. You're going to feel so good once you do, and I know you'll feel more balanced at work. I'm going to list off a series of life events, and as I do, I want you to think about what they all have in common. You ready? Marriage, moving, divorce, starting a new career, the death of a loved one, being fired, having children, retirement. I could keep going, but have you figured out what all these situations share? Change. They all involve change. It's next to impossible to go through any of those life events without changing the way you approach life. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, once said, "The only constant in life is change." And he was right. Change happens every day in the big and small things, in the weather and in the world. So when it comes to your boundaries with your work and life, you shouldn't be surprised that they change as well. Because you change. You don't have the same needs at 23 as you do at 53. After this lesson, you'll be able to assess and adapt your boundaries to better reflect where you are in life right now and as things change in the future. First, you gotta accept the fact that life and work intersect. The idea that you can leave your life at the door to your office is false. Whatever is going on at home will affect how you are at work, though some of us are better at hiding it than others. The idea of putting each aspect of your life into its own box is appealing, but when a big life event like having a child or losing a loved one happens, this becomes much more difficult. We are connected beings. So know that when your life shifts, you need to shift with it. If not, these changes will surface emotionally and mentally when you sit down to work. But you have the power to decide whether or not these life changes will show up positively or negatively in your work. Next, be mindful. Awareness is a powerful practice that can help you navigate change. When taking on something new, like a promotion at work or a larger project, take note of how you feel and how you respond to the new addition to your life over several days. Try to just observe your behavior without judging yourself and then write down what you've seen. Go back and read what you wrote and see what comes up. Are you slipping back into old negative habits or are you creating new ones? Do you have less time or more time for family and friends? All of these observations are going to tell you what boundaries or lines you need to draw as you adapt to the new part of your life. And finally, time is telling. Certain behaviors like staying up late at night to meet a deadline might work well when you're in your 20s and single. But as you move into your 30s and 40s, maybe you've added a partner or child to the picture. Don't expect yourself to be able to stay up late like you once did. Your body has changed. Your life demands have changed. Don't be sad that you can't do that any longer. Instead, adapt to what you need and have the space and time for. If you want to be present on the soccer field for your kiddo at 5 p.m. every weeknight, then you gotta adjust your work schedule to be there. Let someone else in a different phase of life with different boundaries contribute in the way that you once did. Remember, change is the only guarantee. Your limits aren't static because you're not static. Spend some time this week thinking about areas of your life that need to change because you've changed. Change is a good thing if you choose to let it be. What if everyone could read your thoughts? I once lived in an apartment with an extremely extroverted friend. She always wanted to hang out after work, and I did not. I wanted to be alone in my room. I thought after a few times of avoiding her once I got home that she'd get the memo, but she didn't. Instead, she made up a whole series of reasons why I was avoiding her. When we finally talked, I was able to set her straight, and we were both grateful. And she said to me, "I'm glad you told me, Hannah, because I can't read your mind." The truth is, people in your personal and professional lives can't read your mind either. It's vital that you explicitly communicate what you know to be implicitly important to you. After you watch this video, you'll have a solid understanding of how to teach people how to treat you. First, you're responsible for yourself. You get to decide how others get to treat you. And that's what your personal boundaries are, a clear definition of how you'd like to be treated. You think about how you want to be treated all the time. You may not realize it, but it's an ever-running narrative in your mind. Why did she look at me that way? I can't believe he said that to me. These statements are indicators of how you'd like to be treated. However, it's not obvious to others what those preferences are, so you must take responsibility for yourself and figure out how you want to be treated. Next, communicate that in words and action. Tell other people explicitly how they can interact with you in a way that makes you feel comfortable and respected. Spell it out for them. You have the power to teach them what behaviors are acceptable and what aren't. You must share this verbally and then reinforce what you've said with action. You can establish the tone by how you act in your professional sphere. When you model to others how you want to be treated and reinforce that with your words, the faster your needs will become clear to them. Finally, you can't control others' behaviors, but you can control how you react. And how you react to situations, especially when your boundaries are crossed, is another opportunity to teach people how to treat you. Clearly defined boundaries allow you to assert yourself honestly and bravely. It earns you the right to circle back with anyone who's crossed your boundaries and let them know how it affected you. You can reinforce your preferences with them and/or communicate if anything needs to change. You can only own what's yours emotionally and behaviorally. Pointing out to others what you will and won't tolerate helps them own their behaviors too. You have the power to teach people how to treat you. Write that down and place it on your desk, and remember that before you start work. How can you help others treat you better? Take time to think about it, because how you're treated matters. True or false? Setting a boundary usually leads to confrontation. False, but I used to believe it was true. In my early 20s, I was struggling with employment and couldn't afford rent. An older couple in my community offered me a spare bedroom in their home. I moved in and assumed that everything was going to be great. How wrong I was. I did the dishes one way, they preferred another way. I liked alone time, they wanted to be together. It was one miscommunication after another. And after several months of minor and major confrontations, my friend sat me down for a chat. In her wisdom, she told me something I'll never forget. She said, "It's not wrong to have needs and preferences, but it's always easier to share them at the beginning of a new situation than after there's a problem." My mind was blown. I could set a boundary before there was a fight? Yep. After you watch this lesson, you'll have some tried and true tips for setting boundaries calmly at the beginning of your work relationships before any negative scenarios arise. First, boundaries are best when they are proactive, not reactive. When you come from a reactive place, a place of offense, anger, hurt, rejection, you come from a strong emotion that usually leads straight to confrontation. Now, your emotions aren't wrong. You're allowed to feel what you feel. But often when we're in our feelings, we don't say what we truly mean. We say what comes to our minds first, and that's usually hurtful words that we later regret. Setting boundaries reactively in this defensive way drives a wedge in relationships. But setting boundaries proactively from a rational, respectful, and kind stance builds a bridge. Next, to be upfront, it's important to know what triggers you, what gets under your skin, what your limits are. Think through past confrontations or conversations. What hurt you? What made you feel not seen or heard? Those are your trigger points. The issues that deeply matter to you and set you off emotionally when misunderstood or mistreated. When conversations about boundaries happen too late in the relationship, it often leads to petty arguments. What matters to you matters. It's not up for debate. It's crucial you take time to acknowledge who you are and what you need. Getting clear on what matters to you and why will allow you to respect others well too. Finally, a proactive approach can be a routine approach. It's okay to repeat often what you need or what you can and what you can't do. Repetition is vital to retention. For your boss or your colleagues to understand you, it's perfectly okay to kindly repeat what your boundaries are in order to avoid a negative situation later. If you feel you aren't being heard and you're getting frustrated, before you remind others, take a deep breath or go for a walk. Remember that it takes most people a few times to hear something before they really get it. So routinely repeat what you need and say it often. Remember, it's not the boundary setting that leads to confrontation, it's the timing. Take a moment this week to pause and list your boundaries, allowing yourself to head into your next opportunity ready to begin with them and build bridges. The ancient Greek storyteller Aesop once said, "Every truth has two sides. It is well we look at both before we commit ourselves to either." I think he was trying to hint at a saying we often use in our modern world today, that there are often two sides to every story, or two sides to every coin. And that expression, two sides of the same coin, is powerful. We look at things like love and hate, joy and sorrow, success and failure, believing that they are fundamentally different, but in reality, they're closer than we think. The phrase, two sides of the same coin, is merely another way of saying that there's different ways of looking at or dealing with the same situation. This is true when it comes to setting boundaries and establishing expectations. Boundaries, the limits around what you can or can't do, and expectations, what you need to do, are two sides of the same coin. They're two ways of dealing with the same situation, which, in your case, is the workplace. After watching this lesson, you'll be able to understand how your boundaries interact with your employer's expectations and how to balance both in the workplace. First, it's important to realize that boundaries and expectations are independent. They're separate concepts, the heads and tails of the workplace coin. In the context of the workplace, think of your boundaries as your employee perspective. It's what you as the employee can and can't do. Boundaries are your safeguard from overextending yourself. Conversely, expectations are the employer's perspective. They're results-driven, focused on what needs to get done to achieve the organization's goals. Your boundaries as the employee and the employer's expectations are not always mutual. They can contrast, which leads to the next important fact to note. Boundaries and expectations are interdependent. There's a healthy tension between the two. In fact, we often use these words interchangeably. Because when you set boundaries, you establish expectations at the same time. By saying what you need, what your limits are, or where you draw the line, your employer or colleague has to adjust their mind to the new information you've just shared. They have to change their assumption about how things will go. Similarly, you might have to make a sacrifice to meet your employer's expectations for a season. In both situations, there's an end result that can only be achieved through compromise. In this way, boundaries and expectations interact with each other. There's give and take. Finally, you can't overlook this essential truth. Communication is a must. The boundaries and expectation conversation should be a regular, routine occurrence. Basically, it's a coin that should be flipped a lot. It's pivotal that you and your employer partner together to prioritize tasks properly. Why? So a clear and fair expectation can be set for you and your employer won't overstep your boundaries. Dialogue is key to a healthy workplace. Respectful pushback isn't wrong on your part, and employers can be courteous and mindful on their part. But striking the right balance for both sides of the coin only happens in dialogue. Now that you have a grasp of how boundaries and expectations work together, what's a boundary you've been needing to set? Remember that your work environment is a two-sided coin. Find a way to establish your boundary the next time it arises, while also keeping your employer's expectations in mind and fulfilling your job. I know you got this. It's Monday morning. Your alarm goes off and you slap the snooze button and pull the covers over your head. You're cringing inside. You'd rather do anything than go to work today. Why? Because today is your annual review and you've no idea what your boss is going to say. But you doubt it's going to be good. As you get ready for work, you prepare yourself for what's ahead, promising you won't get defensive. You arrive at work and your shoulders, eyes, and head are all drooping to the floor despite that extra espresso shot. Dread has taken over. Once you're at your desk, you wonder, couldn't this process be a little bit easier? Heck yeah, it should be. And after you watch this lesson, you'll know how these hard-to-have conversations, not just with your boss, but also with your peers, can be less daunting and more empowering. First, don't wait till there's a crisis to communicate. When the channels of communication between you and your boss or colleague are closed, that's where doubt and confusion enters. Often, when you don't communicate, you get discouraged and disconnected from what's true. You rely on misinformation, which builds distrust between you and your manager. And distrust leads to defensiveness that doesn't serve anyone. If you have a need or a line you have to draw, communicate that as soon as possible instead of waiting until that boundary has been crossed. Because once it's crossed, it's so much harder to engage in a healthy, productive conversation. Next, what's expected of you at work should be a routine conversation. It should happen every day between you and your manager. You gotta get on the same page. And it's ultimately a boundaries and expectations conversation. It's about the limits of what you can and can't do, balanced with what you need to do. Making this kind of dialogue a healthy habit of your workplace will free you from anxiety when it comes to those quarterly or annual reviews. You'll know what to expect because you and your manager communicate on the regular and have come to a mutual understanding. Finally, distance yourself from the work and then review. Notice I said review, not criticize. I've got a harsh truth to tell you. Performance isn't always about you. It's about the work. Too often, we blend together the work with our worth. But the more you and your manager can step outside of the personal attachment to the work and review together the actual work itself, the healthier and less daunting certain conversations will be. This is an emotional boundary that protects you both. You both should discuss your perspectives on the work and how it went for each party, but the goal of improving the work and executing on the organization's goals should be the primary focus, not your personal successes or failures. Now that you have 3 tips on how to have healthy dialogue at work, how can you apply this? What conversations do you need to have? Schedule them ASAP. Because when you're in constant contact with your coworkers and leaders, amazing work will happen and your reviews won't be such a scary surprise. I used to sit right outside my VP's office, aka my boss's boss. He would stroll by my desk on the regular. One day he came by, handed me a project, and asked, "Can you work on this for me?" I was slammed, but I said yes, and thankfully was able to knock it out. The next day he came by again, handed me a bigger project, and though it was a lot to take on, I did. A few days later, he came to my desk for the third time, and before handing me my next assignment, he said, "You know what they say?" I stared at him. The reward for good work is more work. I was less than thrilled. I already had plenty of work to do, and the extra work he was giving me was not what my job title, job description, or compensation reflected. Not only that, he hadn't approved this new project with my boss. How was I supposed to divide my time between his project and hers? As the days wore on, I became increasingly resentful. I felt taken advantage of. I needed someone to share with me what I'm going to share with you today in this video. After you watch, you'll be able to establish role clarity and boundaries when you are rewarded with more work. First and foremost, role clarity is a dual responsibility. It's a two-way street. It's your leader's job to help you know what your specific tasks are and the expectations and timing they come with. It's your job as the employee to explicitly state back what you understand the assignments and expectations to be. In doing so, any points of confusion can be corrected, and both you and your boss can move forward with a clear understanding of what needs to be done and when. Next, ask questions to help maximize your performance. Sometimes clarity can still be lacking even after expectations are set. This is a great opportunity to ask your leader, what does success look like in this role or project? Where does this fit priority-wise with my other projects? Where do I have autonomy and where do I not? When the answer to these questions are muddy, that's when missteps and micromanagement happen. It feels like a boundary issue, but it's actually a clarity issue. Your manager steps into small project details because there isn't enough clarity on how things should be done. These uncomfortable situations can be avoided through a more thorough discussion. In fact, once you have a clear outline of your role and/or project scope, type it up and send it in a written format via email so it lives as a document that you and your leader can continually refer to. Which leads me to my final thought. Clarity happens at the beginning of a new role, but also throughout its lifetime. Things change and unanticipated tasks pop up. You'll naturally want to take them on, but assess these new projects within the scope of your original job description and the time you have available. That's your chance to revisit your priorities with your supervisor to reestablish and clarify your boundaries. I'm confident you're good at what you do, and you should be rewarded with new challenges and opportunities resentment-free. As you take those new tasks on, take the time to get clear about what's required of you so you can show up and do your best work. I recently bought a house with my husband, who happens to have a lot of home improvement experience. But as we worked on getting the house ready to rent, I noticed he drastically underestimated the time it would take to finish a given project. If he said it would take him 15 hours, it inevitably took him 19. If he said it would take him 19 hours, it took him 25. Eventually, when he'd tell me how long something would take, I'd reply, plus a third. It usually took him the time predicted plus a third of that time to finish. He wasn't really analyzing his time accurately. How often have you done that with work? You sit down at your desk and think, this will take me an hour, but it takes 3. Or something you think will take an hour takes 15 minutes. Not only can that be frustrating, but it causes unnecessary stress. Well, I'm glad you're watching because after you finish this video, you'll be able to implement a plan of action and manage your time better. First, when taking on a task at work, pause and assess. It's pivotal that you understand what's involved in that project. Ask your manager and get as much information as you possibly can. But also ask yourself, what's involved for you personally to get that work done? Sit down and think it through before you begin. Planning is pivotal to productivity. Take 5 to 10 minutes to visualize the project from start to finish. Walk your brain through the process. Will finishing this task require input from others? Will it involve additional meetings? Thinking through what's required will allow you to effectively communicate to your superiors what you need to get the job done. This is setting realistic goals and expectations. And in doing so, you spare yourself a lot of future stress and frustration. Next, once you have a rough idea of what's needed to get this job done, add in a third. In the same way that paper has a margin on all 4 sides, leaving room for thoughts, edits, and last-minute changes, leave margin for yourself and your project. Allow yourself some breathing room. It's easy before starting a new task to let your ambitions drive your production expectations. But it's not always that simple. When you bake in some buffer zone, you take pressure off yourself to focus on the task at hand without overpromising a result that you can't deliver. And overpromising and underdelivering is a common occurrence. The best way to avoid that? This is your final step. Start sooner rather than later. Easier said than done, right? You can't predict everything involved in a given project. Once you start, you might realize there's more involved, but you won't know until you start. It's easier to make a task bigger or smaller in your mind than it actually is. The only way to know for sure? Start. This brings the job into reality, and dealing with reality helps us move out of imaginary unknowns and into what the task actually requires. So go, assess what the task takes, and then get started. And remember, if you realize the job will take more time than you initially thought, it'll be okay. Take a deep breath, communicate that, and just add in a third. The year is 1998. I'm 13 years old and I don't have a cell phone. No one in my family does. I arrange times for my friends to call me on the landline or when to meet up on AOL Instant Messenger, if the dial-up is working. Fast forward to 2022. My daughter is 13, and to my annoyance, she does have a cell phone, and she's on it constantly. Technology has rapidly and radically changed over the last 25 years. And whether we realize it or not, our expectations and boundaries have also radically morphed right along with it. After watching this lesson, you'll be able to instill healthier practices when it comes to technology and communications, both in your professional life and personal life with these 4 tips. First, if you take nothing else away from our brief time together, please take this. You control your technology. It does not control you. You decide when to turn up the noise or when to turn it off. This truth applies to every person in every age and stage of life. Next, when you communicate with someone, pause and think about what's appropriate and polite. In 1998, when we used the landline, it was a house rule that we didn't take calls after 9 p.m. I remember my mom actually telling people that even if they did call after 9 p.m., she wouldn't answer. I remember being scandalized, but with young kids in the house, it made sense. Imagine having a phone ringing loudly late at night. It just didn't work. So be mindful of boundaries like that when you go to communicate. Additionally, be aware that hyperconnectivity doesn't always lead to productivity. With the arrival of email and cell phones, Two technologies that allow us access to one another 24/7, we must be careful to set boundaries, aka limits for ourselves, when we go to send and receive communications of any kind. I say communications because it's not just a text or an email. This includes push notifications from apps like Facebook, Instagram, or the news. Apps that keep us constantly connected versus leaving room for space and rest. Take advantage of the settings that technology thought leaders have put on your phone. Go into silent mode. Set app limits. Take advantage of the do not disturb setting and turn things off for the evening when it's time to rest. Do this for email and work apps, but consider doing this with personal apps as well. Finally, avoid the pitfall of creating a false sense of urgency. Even though you can message people at any time, any day, our non-technological world doesn't stop, and it requires a lot of people. So don't assume that people see your messages as soon as you send them. Don't even assume that they've read them. They have their own commitments and boundaries with their technology. So be patient and remember that your priority is not someone else's emergency. Take a moment to think about what boundaries you need to set up with your technology and then go to the settings on your phone and or email and put those boundaries into action. I know you can do this, and you'll perform better at work and in life if you aren't constantly connected like my 13-year-old. "'Twas the night before Christmas. My mom, sister, and I were all sitting around with a warm beverage in our hand, getting ready for our Christmas Eve feast. I was reading, my mom was cooking, and my sister was talking on the phone. Suddenly, we heard my sister say, 'It's 5:30 p.m. You need to shut your computer down.' She could tell we were shocked and confused. My sister explained, one of my team members was still working and it was time for her to stop. We nodded. She had a point. I'll never forget that moment. As a VP in her company, my sister was communicating to her direct report that having appropriate boundaries at work was not only something she wanted for her team, but expected of her team. In this lesson, I'll teach you how to demonstrate healthy boundaries to your team also and clarify realistic expectations for them. Before I share any practical tips, it's important to acknowledge that as a leader in your organization, you have the opportunity to influence those around you for the better. By virtue of being a leader, you are a constant example of how to operate effectively in the workplace. This also means that your behavior and patterns don't just affect you. They affect those who report to you. To put it simply, your team is watching you. But that's not a bad thing. Here are 3 simple practices you can implement and model to your team to help them have a healthy relationship with their work. First, it starts with you. Get clear on what your optimal work patterns are and communicate those to your team. If you like to work between 2 and 5 p.m. on Saturday afternoon because that's when you're most productive, great. But be aware that unless you communicate what you expect of your team, they might think they need to work that same time slot too. Know your patterns, communicate them, and then explicitly state what your expectations are of your people in respect to those patterns. All you need to say is, this is my practice, but I don't have that expectation of you. My expectations are, and then share accordingly. Another way to model healthy boundaries is utilizing technological advancements. For instance, scheduling emails. Let's go back to that picture of you working Saturday afternoons. Maybe that's when you like to go through your email inbox, clean it out, and send responses. Stop before you hit send. Instead, schedule those emails to be sent during your team's regular working hours. Imagine your team getting to their desk on Monday morning after a refreshing weekend, only to see 7 emails from you that they missed. Even though you told them you don't expect them to answer, they'll still feel behind. Finally, prioritize what matters most and share that with your team. You can only get so many things done well in a day. Make a realistic checklist for yourself. When your team sees you do this, they will know it's okay for them to do it too. You don't want your team to be overwhelmed, and that begins by not overwhelming yourself. Remember, don't just simply state what you expect, model it in your behavior too. This will set you and your team up for success. I know you got this. Work from home. It always sounded so glamorous to me. Enter the year 2020 and a global pandemic, and suddenly working from home lost all of its appeal. Instead of being a cool, refreshing thing to do once in a while, let's be real, who doesn't want to work in their pajamas? It became a mandated requirement. Headlines like "How to work from home without losing your sanity" started cropping up everywhere. People were panicking. How do you work from home well? The key to working well from home can be summed up in one word: boundaries. Pandemic or no pandemic. Boundaries, aka clear parameters, are vital when you work where you live. In this lesson, I'll explain how to evaluate and edit your habits and establish a workspace to help you create the mental space you need to successfully work from home. First, keep your spaces separate and sacred. Just like each room in a house has a designated purpose and is set apart specifically for that purpose alone, so too should be the space you create for work. Designate your workspace and work in that space only. When your work starts to overflow to other areas of your home, you're subconsciously, and quite literally, letting work take over your life. Whether you realize it or not, your brain will start to see work everywhere if you leave files, your computer, and office supplies scattered around your house. And that can be suffocating. Identify work-free zones around your home. Keeping these spaces clearly defined will allow you to relax, recharge, and reconnect with yourself and those in your household. Next, remember that commutes count. They're magical. They're a time to get your head in the zone before work, and they allow you time to decompress after work. It's a time for self-reflection or connection with family and friends. Now that you're working from home, repurpose that commute time. Maybe take a drive to go get a coffee, then come back and start working. In lieu of your commute home, try walking around your neighborhood for 20 minutes to decompress after your workday. When your work is in your living space, it's easy to have tunnel vision and lose perspective. Getting out of your space allows you to get out of your head. That's the gift a commute gives you. Finally, don't mix and mingle. When you're working, work. When you're doing household tasks, do them. Don't start a load of laundry, then send 10 emails, then move the laundry to the dryer, then jump on a work call. You get the picture. All of that back and forth interrupts your focus. If you're in the work zone, stay there. Let those you live with know this is undisturbed time and stick to that commitment yourself. When work is done, be done. Transition into taking care of yourself and your tasks at home. When working from home this week, pause and take stock of your surroundings. Implement these tips and remember, when boundaries are in place, working where you live can be wonderful. I have a confession to make. My whole life, I've struggled with being a people pleaser. And no place was that more obvious than my former work environment. I wanted everyone on my team to like me. I hated the thought of letting anyone down, especially my boss. What if she got mad at me because I wasn't readily available? Or worse yet, What if I lost her approval? I thought my strategy was foolproof. Say yes to everything and I'll make everyone happy. Simple, right? Wrong. Very wrong. This strategy backfired big time. Not only because I let everyone walk all over me, but because I couldn't keep up with the demand. I wasn't being realistic with myself about what I could get done, and that was unfair to others. When my fear of letting everyone down became a reality, I had to step back and reevaluate. Was it really so bad to say no? Not really. And after you watch this lesson, whether you're a people pleaser or not, you'll be able to confidently assess when to say no or yes so that you can accomplish your best work. First, be mindful that when you say yes to one thing, you're inevitably saying no to something else, whether you recognize it or not. On a surface level, saying yes to that extra deadline or meeting seems like the team player type thing to do. But in reality, you're stacking your desk with more and more tasks. Before you say yes, look at your current commitments. If your inbox is full, say no until you can clear out some of those items. When you say yes before assessing if it's realistic to take on, you're going to have to give up something else to make it happen. Usually, your personal time. Next, a forced yes is a false yes, and a false yes leads to frustration. I used to say yes to tasks at work that I hated doing. I felt like it was an agreeable thing to do. But that was wrong. When you say yes to something like that, in reality that you know you shouldn't be taking on, you're going to resent yourself, the job at hand, and your colleague who asked the entire time you're working on that project. This is emotionally draining and sucks up your productivity. And being unproductive is not what you're at work to do. Finally, you'll never reach your fullest potential if you're trying to be all things to all people. So when asked to take on a new task at work, or even in life, ask yourself if you're saying yes out of obligation or exhilaration. Does what you're being asked to do excite you and resonate with who you are and what you value? Or does it go against the grain of what you're about? Being a yes person doesn't guarantee that you'll climb the corporate ladder. Sometimes to move ahead at work, you need to say no. Now that you know what to do and why to say no, look for your next opportunity at work to do so. Saying no is a muscle you have to build like any other, so start small. I know you can do it and move toward being a more balanced employee. Marcus Buckingham was a popular leadership and development author at the end of the 20th century. He wrote many books, including one titled, First, Break All the Rules, What the World's Greatest Managers Do Differently. In this book, he makes a brazen and bold statement. People leave managers, not companies. Yikes, that kind of stings. But do you think it's true? Let's do a quick experiment. What's your reaction when I say micromanaging? Or you do all the work, but your boss takes all the credit. These are common occurrences between managers and employees. In fact, a recent study revealed that 84% of American workers say poorly trained people managers create a lot of unnecessary work and stress. 50% say that they would perform better if their managers were better trained. If you're a manager and watching this, after this video, you'll be able to demonstrate supportive behaviors that help your team perform at its best. First and foremost, embrace the fact that you manage people, not projects. Yes, there are projects that you've been tasked to oversee, but people complete those projects, and the project goals should never be achieved at the expense of your people. One way you can demonstrate that you understand this is by being approachable. Be the type of leader your people can easily communicate with, especially when they're feeling overwhelmed. You're in a relationship with your team. Contractual, yes, but a relationship nonetheless. And there is no relationship in the workplace more impactful than the one between you and your people. So see it as your job to care the most. Dispel the negative association that people can't talk openly with their leader. When you say and act with the desire to put your people first, you will win them over emotionally. When you have your team's buy-in, asking them to do hard things becomes nearly effortless. Next, be mindful of how much you've asked your team to do, both individually and collectively. Your awareness of what's being done and who's doing it is crucial. Your awareness will allow you to set realistic expectations with your team, and they'll love you for that. It displays that you understand the impact of the decisions you're making. Don't overwhelm people for too long. You can challenge them for a sprint, but not for a marathon. Why? Because when your team is overextended, they're going to get bitter and burnt out. And high quality work rarely comes from those negative emotions. And finally, when your team performs well, when they've pushed hard and shown up, recognize them. Recognize their hard work. Reward them. It doesn't have to be through a large bonus. Small gestures show your team you value their efforts. Write an email to your manager praising the efforts of each team member and list specifically how they uniquely contributed. Forget the coffee card, take them to coffee and say thank you. These acts cultivate a positive and inclusive team culture. Never underestimate the power of public praise and recognition. You'll win the loyalty and hard work of your team forever. With approachability, mindfulness, and recognition, I know you can manage your team like never before. Pick one of these 3 small but powerful behavior changes and implement them today. Growing up, whenever I went to a friend's house for a birthday party or some other fun activity, my mom would always tell me that she'd come and get me a half hour before it was over. I'd roll my eyes, twist up my face and say, "Oh, Mom, why?" And she'd respond, "Always leave while you're still having fun." As a 7-year-old girl, I didn't get it. But as I've grown older, I've discovered the wisdom in my mother's saying. It's better to leave when things are good and going well than it is when things are tough and going poorly. And the not so sad reality is whether it's a party or your work, this truth still holds weight. It's better to leave while you're still having fun. Jobs have a natural cycle. You start out ecstatic. You've just arrived at the party. And the party that is work can be good for a while, many years in fact. But you know it when the good has run its course. In this lesson, you'll learn how to identify when you're burnt out and ways to avoid it. Burnout happens when you've let your boundaries slip. Maybe you've given too much time to a project and not enough time to recharging. Maybe you've avoided a conversation out of fear, but it really needed to happen. When you sacrifice these important guidelines, you get burnt out. There are 4 diagnostics you can use to determine whether or not you're burnt out or heading rapidly towards it. The first is physical. Your body bears the brunt of stress, especially unprocessed stress. When you shove your emotions down, you shut your body down. But your body is intelligent. It knows what you need, and it's going to send you signals encouraging you to get what you need. When you're burnt out, you need reprieve. Your body may signal this to you by small things at first, such as an eye twitch. But as time goes on and stress increases, so will these physical signals. Another diagnostic is your emotions, how you feel about work. Do you dread going into the office to the point that it paralyzes you? Are you experiencing discomfort, anger, resentment with your boss and or colleagues? Maybe you're just feeling flat out unhappy. If you've lost your joy in your work, that's a huge indicator that something's off. The next diagnostic is psychological. These are the things you say about your work. Remember, what you say reflects what you think. If more often than not, your sentences begin with phrases like, I hate, I can't stand, I refuse, I won't talk to or work with, it's their fault. These are all indicators that your thoughts towards your current situation have gone sour, and it may be time to look elsewhere. And your final burnout diagnostic is relationship. Are your personal relationships suffering as a result of your work environment's impact on your life? Are you so physically, emotionally, and psychologically worn down that you're lashing out at your loved ones? If the answer is yes, you need to make a change. You spend so much of your time working. It's vital that you pay attention to how you're feeling when you're working. Take a moment to self-reflect by using these 4 diagnostics. You might not have all 4 indicators, but if you have more than 2, that's too many. If you're not having a predominantly positive experience, it's time to get out because you're burnt out and you don't want to burn bridges. Congrats, my friend. I'm so proud of you. You're all done with this course and you rocked it. Thanks so much for joining me and letting me help you grow. You now have a heightened awareness about why boundaries are good and the value of sharing what you need. I hope you're feeling empowered to share that kindly and confidently with others. Remember, you have the power to teach people how to treat you. You get to say, these are my limits and I won't back down from them. You're not responsible for how others react to those limits. You're only responsible for yourself. To encourage you further, I want to share some resources with you that help me grow in my own boundary journey. First, a book called Boundaries by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. This resource is an impactful introduction to the world of boundaries and how to set them. Visit their website, boundariesbooks.com, where you'll find several variations of the book and so many other free resources available, including podcasts and a guide to kickstarting your journey to establishing boundaries. A second resource I'd love to point you to is Brené Brown, period. But her book, Atlas of the Heart, will help you learn the ideal language to describe your needs and experiences. I also suggest listening to her podcast with Glennon Doyle called We Can Do Hard Things, especially the episode titled On Holding Boundaries and Facing Our Fears. Together, they discuss navigating change, choices, integrity, expectations, as well as boundary setting. It's so good. You won't regret listening. Lastly, let's stay in touch. I'd love for you to kick it with me on Instagram at StayRoyalQueen. You can also visit my website for more empowering messages from me. You're allowed to put boundaries in place, my friend. You're valuable and worth protecting. I know you can do it, so go put these boundaries to work. I've got your back.